By 1976, the Ferguson factory in Gosport employed 3,000 workers across 19 acres of production floor, the largest television plant in Europe. A third of every rented screen in Britain carried a Thorn chassis inside it, built by women on soldering tracks who knew a cold joint by feel, housed in rosewood cabinets heavy enough to anchor a sitting room. Then, piece by piece, it was taken apart. Management dismissed the Japanese as makers of cheap copies, until the cheap copies turned out to be better. An actuary who'd never soldered a component sold the company to the French for £90 million. The French stripped the brand and closed the factory. The site is a business park now. There is no plaque. This is the story of how a Jewish refugee from Vienna built an empire that put a television in almost every British home. How arrogance and indifference handed it to strangers, and how the last factory went dark, leaving a silence on Fareham Road that still hasn't been filled. Chapter 1. The Lamp Seller from Vienna. The story begins with a young man on a bicycle. Vienna, 1923. Julius Thorne, 24 years old, Jewish, a veteran of the Austrian army and a freshly minted graduate of the Handelshochschule, left everything he knew to sell gas mantles in England for a company called Also. 3 years later, Also went bankrupt. Thorne stayed. He'd arrived with a suitcase and a talent for selling. What he didn't have was engineering. That came from Alfred Deutsch, a fellow Austrian who joined Thorne's fledgling venture in 1928. The Electric Lamp Service Company, incorporated on the 29th of March that year, trading in imported Continental light bulbs and radio valves. Deutsch was the technical mind. He'd later recall cycling around London with radio parts in a basket strapped to the back of his bicycle. 2 immigrants riding through a city that didn't know their names, carrying the components of what would become one of Britain's largest industrial empires in a wicker basket. Thorne's ambition was something his competitors didn't quite know how to handle. By 1932, he'd acquired his first factory, the Atlas Lamp Works in Edmonton, North London, and began manufacturing Atlas light bulbs. The following year, he formed Lotus Radio to build receivers. And on the 26th of November 1936, Thorne Electrical Industries went public. The share offer was 35 times oversubscribed. 35. A man who'd been peddling imported bulbs from a rented office 8 years earlier now had the City of London fighting to give him money. The Ferguson connection had been growing quietly alongside. Ferguson Radio Corporation was originally an American-Canadian outfit making radio sets for the British market based on contemporary American designs. Incorporated as a British company in January 1935. Thorne became its chairman a year later, and his distribution network began pushing Ferguson products across the country. By 1937, he had sole distributor rights. By 1944, his group handled all of Ferguson's domestic radio production. And on the 9th of July 1946, Thorne bought the entire company outright, every share, for £150,000, financed through a rights issue. Ferguson was his. It was that same year, 1946, that the first Ferguson television rolled off the line. A year later, the Ferguson 841T appeared at the Radio Olympia trade show, and a radio company became a television company. The timing was impeccable. Britain was rebuilding. Families wanted normality. And normality increasingly meant a screen in the corner of the sitting room. What made Thorne formidable wasn't vision alone. It was control. The International Directory of Company Histories describes a domineering personality who personally supervised every aspect of his company's activities, gaining a reputation for hard work and tireless enthusiasm for profit. He was the kind of man who'd change his Rolls-Royce for a Jaguar when the economy tightened, parking it in front of Thorne House so every employee would see it and understand that this wasn't a year to ask for a rise. A former German manager named Win Labuda remembered watching him at 75 years old, climbing an endless flight of stairs back to his office simply because he'd forgotten to switch the light off. The man who'd built a lighting empire couldn't bear to waste a bulb. That same domineering nature reportedly squelched an early proposed merger with EMI, years before it would eventually happen on his terms. And there was a weakness buried inside the strength. Thorne had a tendency for developing products without properly evaluating consumer preferences. He trusted his instincts over research. For decades, those instincts were right. When they stopped being right, there was nobody in the room powerful enough to say so. But that reckoning was decades away. In the late 1940s, Jules Thorne was building something extraordinary. A vertically integrated empire that would stretch from the factory floor to the customer's living room, from the light bulb in the ceiling to the television underneath it. And to do it properly, he needed a factory. A real one. Purpose-built. Modern. He found it on the road between Fareham and Gosport. Chapter 2. The Factory on Fareham Road. Thorne didn't build the Gosport factory. He bought it, and the company that came with it. Ultra Electric Limited had been founded in 1925 by Edward E. Rosen, and in October 1956, Ultra opened a brand new purpose-built television factory on Fareham Road, on the outskirts of Gosport. The local press described it as equipped with the most modern plant for the production of domestic radio and television receivers under the best possible working conditions. Ultra moved in fully by 1959, a gleaming facility on the Hampshire coast, positioned to draw from a workforce that knew electronics and precision engineering. Gosport had spent generations supporting the Royal Navy and Portsmouth Dockyard. The skills that had built warships translated remarkably well to building television sets. Soldering, wiring, circuit assembly. The hands that fitted sonar could fit a tuner unit. In May 1961, Thorne paid £2.4 million for Ultra Radio and Television Limited, bringing the Gosport factory into his empire. Under the Ultra name, the plant continued producing televisions, alongside Ferguson-branded sets, manufactured at Enfield in North London. But by 1974, Ultra as a brand was discontinued, and Gosport became a Ferguson factory. The name on the front, the name on the sets, the name the town knew. What Thorne was assembling, piece by piece, was something no other company in Britain had attempted at this scale. He didn't just make televisions, he rented them. In 1939, the same year war broke out, Thorne had created DER, Domestic Electric Rentals, as an in-house rental subsidiary. It had just one outlet until 1947. By 1968, it had 397 stores, and DER was only one arm of the machine. There was Rumbelows, founded by Sidney Rumbelow in Hatfield in 1949, absorbed into the Thorne empire in the early 1960s. And then the crown jewel, Radio Rentals, founded in 1930 by Percy Perring Toms in Brighton, with a first-year turnover of £780. By 1936, it was the largest rental organisation in Britain, 50,000 customers. By its peak, Radio Rentals had over 2 million subscribers, more than 500 shops, and 3,600 technicians deployed across the country. Thorne acquired Radio Rentals in 1968 for somewhere between £155 and £180 million, creating the world's largest television rental company. 1/3 of all 7.5 million rented televisions in Britain carried a Thorne badge under one name or another. The elegance of the model was almost architectural. Ferguson televisions, built at Gosport, were sold under the Ferguson name through retail. The same sets, built on the same chassis with the same Thorne-designed circuitry, were rebadged as Baird and fed into the Radio Rentals fleet. Manufacturing could run through the quiet summer months producing rental stock, smoothing out the seasonal demand that crippled competitors. By 1968, Thorne controlled 2.6 million rental subscribers and 1,300 stores. The entire value chain, from the soldering iron at Gosport to the television in your nan's sitting room, belonged to one company. And renting wasn't a niche behaviour. It was how Britain watched television. By about 1962, of 12 million television sets operating in the country, half were rented. Of new sets being installed, 80% were rented. In America, that figure would have been laughable. In Britain, it made perfect sense. A colour television in the 1970s cost roughly £300, the equivalent of about £3,500 today. That was a modest car. And the sets were notoriously unreliable. Valve technology, cathode ray tubes, hundreds of soldered connections, any one of which could fail, and frequently did. Renting meant that when your Ferguson went dark on a Wednesday evening, a van arrived. One major firm was handling 30,000 service calls every single week. The engineer fixed it or swapped it. You were back watching Coronation Street by Thursday. No bill, no fuss. And when colour arrived, or when the 625-line standard replaced 405, or when video recorders appeared, you upgraded, no sunk cost in the obsolete box gathering dust in the spare room. It was a business model built on British weather, British caution, and British electronics being just unreliable enough that owning outright felt like a gamble. Jules Thorne understood all three. Chapter 3. The Tracks. Imagine walking through those gates on Fareham Road in the mid-1960s, clocking in with 3,000 others, the morning shift forming a slow river of bodies moving from the car park and the bus stops toward the factory entrance. The first thing you'd notice was the scale. 7.6 hectares, nearly 19 acres of production floor, stores, testing bays and offices spread alongside Fareham Reach. Then the sound. Not one sound but a layered hum, the whir of conveyor belts, the sharp hiss of soldering irons meeting flux, the click-click-click of components being placed into printed circuit boards by hands that could do it with their eyes closed. And underneath it all, the low electrical drone of a building that never quite fell silent, not even between shifts. The production lines were called tracks. Conveyor-based systems where a television chassis, bare at one end, complete at the other, moved past worker after worker, each performing a single precise task. At one station, a woman would solder resistors. At the next, capacitors. Then transistors, and later integrated circuits, as the technology evolved across the decades. Each soldering point had to be clean, bright, and mechanically sound. A cold joint, dull, grainy, unreliable, could mean a dead set in someone's sitting room 6 months later. The women on those tracks knew the difference by feel, and they were overwhelmingly women. The photographic record from the Portsmouth News tells the story in image after image, groups of women workers spanning the decades, from the Ultra years through to the Ferguson era. Mrs. Brenda Upton of Fareham sent in a photograph of the girls from the Ultra television factory in the 1960s. Dorothy Cousins shared a Christmas 1958 picture, naming her fellow workers Maureen Downing and Janet. A woman called Rosalind remembered starting at the Ultra factory at 16. Her first job, her first wage packet, her entry into the adult world through a soldering iron and a set of printed circuit boards. The process that moved through their hands was intricate. Cathode ray tubes arrived from specialist plants. Thorne operated a tube factory at Skelmersdale in Lancashire, employing 1,400 before it closed in 1976. At Gosport, the assembly sequence ran from components to completed television in a series of defined stages. First, the PCB assembly on the tracks, then chassis construction, where completed boards were fitted into modular units, and modularity was a Thorne innovation that mattered enormously. Each board could be swapped out individually for servicing, which meant a radio rentals engineer arriving at your home didn't need to take the whole set apart. He pulled one board, slotted in another, and you were watching the news again. The modular design wasn't just clever engineering. It was the physical link between the factory floor and the rental business model. After the chassis came sub-assembly integration, tuner units, power supplies, signal processing modules fitted together like organs in a body. Then the cathode ray tube itself was mounted into the cabinet, with the deflection yoke and convergence magnets precisely aligned. A misaligned yoke meant colour fringing, red ghosts on one side of the picture, blue on the other. Getting it right required patience and a steady hand. And then the cabinets. Through the 1960s and into the early 1980s, Ferguson televisions came housed in real wood, teak, rosewood, oak veneer. Substantial pieces of furniture designed to occupy a permanent place in the sitting room. A 26-inch Ferguson in a rosewood cabinet wasn't something you moved on a whim. It sat where it was put, and the family arranged itself around it. Later models shifted to plastic housings as costs tightened and tastes changed. But for 2 decades, a Ferguson television was as much joinery as electronics. The final stage was testing. Every set was powered up, tuned and checked. Fault finders, skilled technicians who could diagnose a dead set from the behaviour of a single capacitor, worked the line's end, catching defects before dispatch. Workers at Gosport recall fault finding on the 850 and 900 chassis models in 1964 and 65, tracing signal paths through circuits they knew as intimately as the streets they'd grown up on. And Thorne's engineers had created something genuinely remarkable. The Thorne 2000 chassis, launched as the HMV Colourmaster Model 2700 in 1967, was the world's first fully transistorized colour television. No valves, fully solid-state, modular, a genuine British technical triumph that the rest of the industry hadn't yet matched. Its successor, the Thorne 3000, ran for years with thousands of units produced. Britain had invented the future of television manufacturing. The irony of what happened next would take 2 decades to become fully visible. A former Thorne engineer who once delivered a prototype ultrasonic remote control television to Sir Jules Thorne's home remembered the visit vividly. He wanted us to leave the set on the right channel to show the horse racing results, the engineer recalled. Thorne said he owned one of the horses that was running. His wife said they probably wouldn't use the remote control and promptly took it away. The engineer added, almost as an afterthought, "I think he was smoking a large cigar." That was the world inside the Ferguson empire. A man who built a company that put televisions in millions of British homes, whose wife didn't want the remote control, who smoked cigars and watched the racing and employed 3,000 people in a factory on the Hampshire coast. Chapter 4. A third of every screen in Britain. Jules Thorne was knighted in 1964. By then, the brands under his control, Ferguson, Ultra, HMV, Marconiphone, all operated through his British Radio Corporation subsidiary, dominated British sitting rooms. The product range had expanded far beyond televisions. Battery-operated portable transistor radios, solid oak 6-foot-wide radiograms with hydraulic lids and Garrard turntables, open-reel tape recorders, hi-fi systems, personal cassette players. If it made sound or showed pictures and it sat in a British living room, there was a decent chance Thorne had built it. The merger with EMI came in October 1979. EMI accepted £169 million, and the combined Thorn EMI became one of Britain's largest operating companies. 80,484 employees, £3.3 billion in sales, a member of the FTSE 100. Simultaneously, the world's largest television rental business, one of the big 4 global record companies, a major UK defence contractor, Europe's leading lighting manufacturer, and, this is the detail that matters most for our story, Britain's only remaining colour television manufacturer. That last fact deserves a moment's context. By 1983, every other British-owned company that had once made colour televisions had ceased production. Pye in Cambridge, Echo in Southend, Bush, Murphy in Welwyn Garden City, Decca, Dynatron in Maidenhead, all gone. The Gosport factory was the last one standing. Ferguson, the brand Jules Thorne had bought for £150,000 in 1946, was the final name on the final production line. Peter Viggers, Conservative MP for Gosport, had told the House of Commons on the 22nd of January 1976 what that meant for his constituency. "My constituency contains the largest television set factory in Europe," he said. "Thorne's Ultra Factory, employing more than 3,000 people. It is a cheerful, prosperous, successful factory, the largest in Europe. 3,000 workers. The sets they built were rented to 2.5 million households through 1,300 high street shops. A third of every television screen glowing in a British living room on any given evening carried a Thorne chassis inside it, whether the badge on the front said Ferguson or Baird or HMV. When Thorne closed its Bradford factory in April 1978, then described as the most modern and largest TV factory in all of Europe, with the loss of 2,200 jobs, Gosport became the primary television manufacturing plant. Edward Lyons, Labour MP for Bradford West. noted in the heated parliamentary debate that followed that Thorne's consumer electronics division had recorded net profits of £57.4 million in 1977. The company wasn't struggling. It was consolidating. And consolidation meant Gosport carried the weight. The town had shaped itself around the factory the way a coastal town shapes itself around a harbour. Gosport had always been a working town. Generations of families tied to the Royal Navy, to Portsmouth Dockyard, to the military infrastructure that lined its waterfront. The Ferguson factory fitted that pattern. Fathers and daughters worked the same site. Skills passed between generations. The Friday wage packet from Fareham Road paid the mortgage, filled the shopping trolley, kept the kids in school shoes. The bus routes ran to the factory gates. The shift patterns set the rhythm of the town. Jules Thorne didn't see the empire's fullest reach. He'd reluctantly retired as chairman in 1976, and on the 12th of December 1980, he died in Westminster, aged 81, not long after watching his company's successful takeover of EMI. He'd devoted his final years to racehorses and impressionist paintings, winning the 2,000 guineas at Newmarket in 1972 with his horse High Top. He'd married his second wife, Jean Norfolk, in 1971, and through the Sir Jules Thorne Charitable Trust. He'd given generously to causes including the Haifa Technion, a Jewish refugee from Vienna who'd arrived in England with nothing, who'd built an empire that employed 80,000 people and controlled a third of every rented television in Britain. His biography, Sir Jules Thorne, The Man and His Empire, by Jim Lewis, wouldn't be published until 2021, 4 decades after his death. By the time the book appeared, the factory was long gone, the rental shops were shuttered, the brand had been sold, stripped and licensed to strangers. Everything Thorne had built with that relentless, domineering, cigar-smoking, light-switch-checking energy had been disassembled by men who never set foot on the Gosport production floor. But that was still to come. In 1980, the year Thorne died, the Gosport factory was still humming, still building, still employing thousands. The tracks were still moving, the soldering irons were still hot, they just didn't know what was coming across the water. Chapter 5. The Summit. Nobody recognised. The early 1980s should have been Ferguson's finest hour. Britain's only colour television manufacturer. The Thorne 2000 and 3000 chassis, world-leading modular designs. A vertically integrated empire that controlled everything from the production line to the rental counter. 80,000 employees across the group. 3.3 billion in annual sales. FTSE 100. As late as 1985, the Gosport plant was still producing Ferguson models 38020 and 38030, 12-inch monochrome portables priced at just £49.95. British manufacturing competing at the budget end. Proof, if anyone needed it, that the factory could still make sets people wanted to buy. But the numbers told a story that the Boardroom didn't want to read. The rental model, the foundation on which the entire Thorne empire rested, was cracking from within. Television sets were becoming more reliable. Not Thorne's sets, specifically. Everyone's. Solid-state circuits replaced valves. Integrated circuits replaced discrete transistors. The sets broke down less often. And when a television doesn't break down, the case for renting it, rather than buying it outright, begins to dissolve. A former radio rentals engineer, looking back, put it plainly. By 1981, the industry was in decline. TV receivers were becoming more reliable, which spurred customers into buying rather than renting. There was a deeper irony buried inside that trend. Thorne's own engineering, the modular chassis, the solid-state circuitry, the improved components, had helped make televisions more reliable. The better they built them, the less reason customers had to rent. The factory was quietly undermining the business model that justified its existence. And there was something else. Something arriving from the Far East in cardboard boxes, stacked on container ships, clearing customs at Felixstowe and Southampton. Sets that were smaller, lighter, cheaper, and, this was the part that nobody at Thornhouse wanted to admit, better. The summit had already passed. Nobody inside those walls could see it, and by the time they looked down, The ground beneath them had already begun to sunk. Chapter 6. The Cheap Copies. 3 Japanese electronics companies entered the British market in rapid succession around 1969 and 1970 in Sony, Matsushita, known to consumers as Panasonic, and Hitachi. The Times reported on the 21st of August 1970 that Hitachi's arrival represented another challenge on the home market from a Japanese rival, the third in recent months. The British response was not alarm. It was something closer to amusement. The prevailing attitude toward Japanese electronics in the early 1970s is preserved in a passage that found its way into educational materials for decades afterwards. The Japanese were able to exploit their strengths many years ago, and their success was at first either not understood in the West or was dismissed as something which could have been produced only at their low price. They were sold because they were cheap copies of other people's ideas churned out of a workhouse dedicated to hard grind above all. Cheap copies. Other people's ideas. A workhouse. The language tells you everything about how seriously British industry took the threat. Jack Akerman was the managing director of Mullard, the only UK manufacturer of colour television tubes, the glass hearts that beat inside every CRT set. In 1977, when Hitachi was pushing to establish a manufacturing presence in Britain, Akerman was described as sounding positively sniffy about Hitachi's technology. He told The Times, "We must be absolutely satisfied that our merchandise is going to be used in a technical environment where it will perform well and live well." The condescension is remarkable. This was the man responsible for supplying the tubes that went into British-made televisions, and he was publicly questioning whether Japanese factories met his standards, at a time when Japanese sets were already demonstrably more reliable than British ones. And yet Akerman, in the same interview, issued a warning so precise it reads like prophecy. "Those first few years will be as smooth as silk," he said. "But then, watch out. In Japan they are planning for the year 2000. They want to dominate the electronic equipment business." He could see the future. He just couldn't stop talking down to it. Derek Harris, commercial editor of The Times, captured the national mood in a November 1977 opinion piece that asked whether Hitachi was going to become the enemy within the walls. Fear and dismissal braided together. The Japanese were simultaneously too primitive to worry about and too dangerous to let in. Britain held both ideas at once and acted on neither. The technological gap was real, and it was widening. A Princeton Office of Technology assessment report found that service calls for American-made colour televisions were 5 times more frequent than for Japanese-made sets in 1974. British reliability was comparable, or worse. The reason was structural. Japanese manufacturers, Sony, Matsushita, Hitachi, made their own components in-house. They controlled quality from the raw silicon to the finished set. British manufacturers were assemblers. As one former Thorn engineer explained bluntly, everything was bought in. Capacitors, resistors, semiconductors, mostly all the wound components, the CRTs, probably the tuners and triplers too. Thorne designed the chassis. But the components that populated it came from dozens of outside suppliers, and Thorne's quality control ended at the goods-in door. Japanese firms didn't just make better parts, they made them better by philosophy. Total quality management. Kaizen. Continuous improvement at every level, from the factory floor upward. These weren't slogans. They were operating systems built into the culture of production. British factories had nothing equivalent. The shop floor and the boardroom existed in separate worlds, connected by distrust and demarcation lines. The UK government tried to hold back the tide. Japanese TV imports were restricted to a maximum screen size of 18 inches, a policy designed to protect British production of the larger sets that dominated sitting rooms. A former radio rentals worker recalled what happened when the restriction was eventually lifted. Once the restrictions were lifted, the floodgates opened. It was an admission, years after the fact, that the only thing keeping British television manufacturing alive was a bureaucratic dam. Not quality, not innovation, not customer loyalty. A rule about screen sizes. Peter Viggers, the same MP who'd praised the Gosport factory as cheerful, prosperous and successful in 1976, delivered a warning in that same speech that nobody in the industry appeared to hear. My fear is that the British television set manufacturers will go the way of the British radio set manufacturers, he told the Commons. Japanese manufacturers captured the United Kingdom component market and then without too much difficulty captured the set manufacturing capacity. As a result, there is no major British-owned radio set manufacturer. It will be easy for the television industry in this country to go the same way. He attacked government policy too. 50 changes in purchase tax rates, VAT rates, hire purchase rates, and credit terms in the past 10 years, he said. How could any manufacturer plan investment against that kind of instability? And in the 1978 debate that followed the Bradford closure, the minister himself acknowledged that Viggers had spoken with appropriate severity as to the way in which the British electronics industry had yielded markets to foreign competitors, a way that cannot be to the credit of that industry. Even the government knew. Even the government said so in the official record. And nothing changed. Meanwhile, the Japanese weren't waiting for permission. Sony established Britain's first Japanese electronics factory at Bridgend in South Wales in 1973, opened by Prince Charles following discussions between the Prince and Sony founder Akio Morita. It began with record decks, then shifted to the Trinitron colour television, and the Bridgend plant became the largest producer of Trinitron colour TVs in Europe. Matsushita set up in Cardiff, eventually employing over 1,600 people making televisions and microwaves, with satellite plants across Wales and southern England. Hitachi, after fierce hostility from British competitors, formed a joint venture with GEC in 1978, adopting a factory in Aberdare with a workforce of over 2,000. When GEC sold its half to Hitachi in 1984, Hitachi imposed a single union policy, cut the workforce to 800, and made the factory competitive. The Japanese weren't undercutting British manufacturing with cheap labour. They were building factories in Britain, employing British workers on British soil, and producing better televisions. The problem wasn't ages or geography. It was management, design philosophy, and a willingness to pursue relentless improvement that British boardrooms couldn't match. The European Electronic Component Manufacturers Association warned in October 1978 that the European electronics industry was critically endangered by cheap imports from Japanese TV component makers. But by then, calling them cheap was itself the problem. They weren't cheap. They were better. And cheaper. Both at once. Which is the combination that destroys industries. And buried inside the rental model, the jewel of Thorne's empire, was a flaw so perverse it almost reads as satire. The business case for renting depended on televisions breaking down. When your set failed, the service call became an opportunity. The engineer arrived, diagnosed the fault, and often suggested an upgrade, from black and white to colour, from a 14-inch to a 22-inch, from an old chassis to a new one. Each upgrade meant higher rental income. Poor reliability wasn't a problem for the rental business, it was the engine. Japanese sets, by being far more reliable, didn't just compete with Ferguson televisions. They undermined the entire economic logic of renting one. The better the competition built their sets, the less reason anyone had to rent a British one. And nobody at Thorne House appeared to grasp the full implications of that sentence until it was far too late. Chapter 7. The Boardroom. Coup. And the relentless Axeman. Jules Thorne had built his empire through personal control, every decision flowing through one man's domineering will. The men who inherited that empire had no such coherence. What followed was a decade of strategic lurching that would leave the Ferguson factory, and everyone who worked in it, stranded. Peter Leicester became managing director after the Thorn EMI merger. His background was varied: oil, chemicals, transport, brewing, and his vision was grand. He wanted to create an integrated communications and entertainment business with particular emphasis on advanced electronics. In July 1984, he acquired Inmos, a government-funded microchip manufacturer, absorbing it into the group. In May 1984, he attempted a merger with British Aerospace. It failed. The strategic logic was sprawling, ambitious, and fatally unfocused. Leicester employed a Boston consulting group planning model that, in the assessment of the company's own historians, starved the successful enterprises within the company of funds needed to maintain competitive product lines. The profitable divisions, the ones that actually made money, including consumer electronics, were drained to feed speculative acquisitions. In July 1985, Leicester was removed from the board in what was described as a boardroom coup. His replacement would prove far more consequential. Colin Greaves Southgate was born on the 24th of July 1938 in New Malden, Surrey. Educated at the City of London School, where he hated sport but loved maths, he trained as an actuary at the National Provident Institution and described it later as the worst 2.5 years of his life. He moved into computing at International Computers and Tabulators, then in 1970, aged 32, co-founded a software company called Software Sciences with his father-in-law. He sold it, first to BOC, then to Thorn EMI, making his first million. Southgate joined Thorn EMI in 1983 as head of information technology. He was a numbers man, a deal maker, a man who looked at a sprawling industrial conglomerate and saw a portfolio to be rationalised. After Leicester's ousting, Sir Graham Wilkins, a non-executive director whose career had been in pharmaceuticals at Beecham, became chairman and appointed Southgate as managing director. Wilkins was blunt about the diagnosis. The fundamental problem with Thorn EMI at the time was that it was too broadly based on activities that were loss-making and which we could not afford to keep. We had to prune things which had no immediate profit potential. Prune. The word is worth sitting beside for a moment. Not rebuild, not invest, not modernise. Prune. The metaphor reveals the thinking. Thorn EMI's businesses were branches on a tree, and the ones that weren't bearing fruit quickly enough would be cut. Southgate became CEO in July 1988 and chairman the following year. Management today called him a relentless axeman. The description was earned. Out went Thorn's heating company. Out went EMI's screen entertainment division. Out went Thorn's domestic appliances. Out went Elstree Studios. Out went Inmos. And out went Ferguson televisions, along with around 60 lesser enterprises sold to whoever would buy them. The divestments brought in over $700 million. Southgate's crowning achievement, by his own lights, was purchasing the rights to many of the Beatles' biggest hits in 1993. That tells you where television manufacturing sat in his hierarchy of value. On the logic of breaking up the empire Thorne had spent 50 years assembling, Southgate was characteristically direct. After all, if people cannot be transferred from one part of the company to another, and they can't be transferred from a music company to an engineering company, there is not much point in them being under the same corporate ownership. It was a clean, rational argument. It was also the death warrant for the Gosport factory, signed by a man who'd made his career in software and actuarial science and had never soldered a component in his life. Chapter 8. Sold to the French. On the 17th of June 1987, Thorn EMI's son announced the sale of its Ferguson consumer electronics business to Thompson Grand Public, the consumer arm of Thompson SA, a French state-owned electronics conglomerate. The price was £90 million. The operation being sold turned over $300 million a year. Lock, stock and tubes, as the financial press put it. Thorn. EMI's share price rose 17 pence to 750 on the news. The city was pleased. The city had wanted this. The man behind the purchase was Alain Gomez, born 1938, Harvard-educated, appointed chairman and CEO of Thompson Brandt in 1982, following the socialist government's wave of nationalisations. Gomez was described as a celebrated turnaround artist, widely admired by conservative industrialists. His strategy was straightforward and had been proven before. Acquire established consumer electronics brands primarily for their marketing networks and distribution channels. not for their manufacturing. He'd done exactly this with Telefunken, the German brand acquired from AEG in 1984 and 85. Thompson was widely denounced in West Germany for maintaining little more than the Telefunken brand name and its marketing network. The factories were secondary, the brand was the asset, the workforce was the cost. 1 month after buying Ferguson, Gomez acquired General Electric's entire US consumer electronics division, the RCA, GE, and ProScan brands, in exchange for Thompson's medical equipment unit plus cash. Together, the 1987 acquisitions made Thompson the world's 4th largest consumer electronics company. Gomez was building a global marketing empire out of other countries' industrial legacies. Ferguson was simply the British chapter of a pattern already written in German. A Harvard Business Review interview with Gomez in 1990, titled "From National Champion to Global Competitor," laid out his vision for European industrial consolidation. It was articulate, strategic, and entirely indifferent to the question of what happened to the people who'd built the things he was buying. That wasn't callousness, precisely. It was a worldview in which factories were inputs and brands were outputs, and the connection between the two was a matter of cost, not culture. Initially, the Gosport factory continued to operate under Thompson's ownership. Ferguson televisions were still manufactured there. But gradually, month by month, model by model, Thompson-designed chassis replaced Thorne-designed ones. The engineering that British workers had refined over decades was swapped out for French designs, produced to different specifications, optimised for Thompson's European supply chain rather than for the skills on the Gosport production floor. The High Wycombe Plastics Moulding Factory, which had produced the casings for Ferguson sets, closed in 1990. The signal was unmistakable. Thompson wasn't investing in British manufacturing. It was winding it down, component by component, site by site, in the methodical manner of a company that had bought a brand and had no further use for the buildings attached to it. Ferguson was reclassified internally. In Thompson's brand hierarchy, it became a support brand, primarily used for short-term targeted marketing operations in Europe. Not a flagship, not even a secondary mark. A support brand. The name that had once meant British-made, British-designed, the largest television factory in Europe, reduced to a marketing label to be deployed and withdrawn as quarterly targets required. The workers at Gosport could read the direction as clearly as any corporate strategy document. The new designs arriving from France. The familiar chassis disappearing from the production schedule. The redundancies, smaller at first, then larger. The factory that had employed 3,000 people at its peak was contracting, shift by shift, like a lung slowly emptying of air. Chapter 9. The Last Sets. The precise date the Gosport factory closed is remarkably uncertain. The event happened in 1992, before widespread internet news archiving, before digital records became the default. What survives in the historical record is sparse. Local history sources confirm approximately 700 jobs were lost when the factory closed. 700. Down from 3,000. Which means the slow bleeding had already carried away more than 2,000 livelihoods before the final cut arrived. No specific worker quotes from the closure have survived in available digital records. No union statements. No protest accounts. The relevant union would likely have been the EETPU, the Electrical, Electronic, Telecommunications and Plumbing Union, or its successor, the AEEU. The Portsmouth News, the local paper that had published those photographs of women workers across the decades, Dorothy Cousins' Christmas picture, Brenda Upton's snapshot of the girls, almost certainly covered the closure. But those pages sit in a physical archive, undigitised, unread by the internet. The silence around the Gosport closure is itself a kind of erasure. A factory that once employed more people than some market towns have residents, and its ending wasn't considered significant enough to survive into the digital age. What we know is this. The machines stopped. The tracks that had carried television chassis passed thousands of pairs of hands. The soldering stations, the testing bays, the fault-finding benches where skilled technicians diagnosed dead sets from the flicker of a single component, all of it went quiet. The last Ferguson television to be built on British soil by a historically British company rolled off those lines sometime in 1992, and nobody recorded its serial number or kept it for posterity. The closure didn't happen in isolation. Gosport was losing everything at once. The defence establishments that had employed generations alongside the factory, Royal Clarence Yard, Priddy's Hard, St George's Barracks, all closed in the 1990s. HMS Dolphin was converted to a military medical college. The town that had been built around the Navy and rebuilt around the factory found both pillars removed within the same decade. The military skills that had made Gosport's workforce attractive to ultra-electric in 1956, the precision, the electronics training, the steady hands, were now skills without a destination. Thompson didn't mourn. Alain Gomez continued his programme of acquisitions and consolidations until he was dismissed in February 1996, when the French government moved to privatise Thompson. The Ferguson brand was renamed Thompson Multimedia Sales UK Limited that same year. The name itself erased from the corporate structure, as if the 6 decades of British manufacturing it represented were an administrative inconvenience to be tidied away. Gosport fell quiet. Not all at once. Towns don't die like factories, with a single shift ending and the lights going off. They diminish. The bus routes that once ran to the factory gates served fewer passengers. The shops that relied on 3,000 wage packets a fortnight saw their takings thin. The young people who might have followed their mothers onto the tracks looked at the shuttered building on Fareham Road and understood that their futures lay elsewhere. If they could afford the ferry across the harbour to Portsmouth, or the bus to Southampton, or the train to London from a station that didn't exist. Because Gosport's railway line had closed in 1953. Today, Gosport has 0.52 jobs per working age resident, the 13th lowest figure in the United Kingdom. It is one of the largest towns in England without a railway station. The indices of deprivation show Gosport areas becoming increasingly deprived since 2015. The people are still there. The work is not. Chapter 10. The Hollow Name. The Ferguson brand didn't die when the Gosport factory closed. It did something arguably worse. It became a ghost. A name attached to products it had no hand in designing, no connection to manufacturing, no relationship with beyond a licensing agreement, and a quarterly royalty check. After Thompson's acquisition, the brand passed through a series of custodians. DSGI, the parent company of Dixons and Currys, licensed the Ferguson name until 2006. Comet used it until 2012, the year before the chain itself went into administration. The name that had once meant 3,000 workers on a Hampshire production floor was printed on boxes containing sets built in China, Turkey and Eastern Europe by companies that had never heard of Jules Thorne. Thompson S. A itself underwent its own dissolution. It rebranded as Technicolor SA in January 2010, abandoning consumer electronics entirely to focus on professional video and media services. In 2004, it had formed a joint venture with China's TCL, TTE, TCL, Thompson Electronics, handing over all television manufacturing and making TCL the world's largest TV producer. The company Alain Gomez had built by acquiring other nations' industrial legacies eventually surrendered its own. In May 2022, Technicolor sold its trademark licensing operations to Talisman Brands, a Houston-based firm. The Ferguson name, along with Thompson, RCA, Telefunken, Saber and Nordmender, now belongs to a brand management company in Texas. Technicolor Creative Studios entered administration in February 2025. In 2017, a small company called Cello Electronics, based in Bishop Auckland, County Durham, licensed the Ferguson name from Technicolor and began producing Ferguson-branded LED televisions. Cello's CEO, Brian Palmer, said something that carries a particular weight. "I started out in this business selling Ferguson to consumers and truly understand the trust people had in the brand over the years." Trust. A word that connects the woman soldering resistors on the Gosport tracks in 1965 to the customer opening a Ferguson box in 2017. Separated by half a century, a closed factory, 3 changes of ownership, and a licensing chain that stretches from Hampshire to Paris to Houston to County Durham. The trust Palmer described was real. It had been earned by the quality of the sets and the reliability of the service vans and the knowledge that if your Ferguson went wrong, someone would come and fix it. What that trust is attached to now is a different question. The rental empire followed the factory into oblivion. Rumbelows, which had never made a profit in 24 years under Thorne, losing £12 million annually, closed in February 1995. 285 stores, 2,900 jobs. Southgate called it a small player in a brutally competitive market. After the 1996 demerger that split Thorn EMI into EMI Group and Thorn plc, the rentals rump was acquired in 1998 by a subsidiary of Japan's Nomura Group. The final irony of a Japanese company buying the remnants of the empire that had dismissed Japanese competition as cheap copies 20 years earlier. Radio Rentals merged with Granada TV Rental to form Box Clever in 2000. Box Clever went into administration in 2003. All high street stores closed by 2004. The Nomura-backed entity eventually spawned Bright House, a rent-to-own chain that targeted the poorest customers with the highest interest rates. Bright House collapsed into administration in 2020. The business model Jules Thorne had built, making the television, renting it, servicing it, upgrading it, controlling the entire chain from factory floor to sitting room, had been picked apart, sold off, rebadged, degraded, and finally extinguished. Each iteration further from the original. Each one smaller, meaner, less connected to the thing it claimed to be. The foreign-owned factories that had outlasted Gosport eventually closed too. Sony's Bridgend plant shut in December 2005. 400 jobs lost. Tony Blair called it tragic. Toshiba's Plymouth factory closed in late 2009 after 28 years. Managing Director Andy Bass said the company was indebted to the people who had worked there. At peak, Toshiba Plymouth had produced 600,000 colour televisions a year. Production moved to Kobiesice, Poland. The very last was Sanyo's factory in Lowestoft, occupying the old Pye and Phillips plant, acquired by Sanyo in 1982. It closed in February 2009 with the loss of 60 jobs. 60. Down from 350 to 450 at peak, when the plant had produced 500,000 televisions annually. Vice President Noel Salmon explained, "The introduction of LCD television imports, primarily from China, Turkey and Eastern Europe, created price-down pressure. Most factories have now closed and transferred their manufacturing to countries with low-wage economies." Unite Union officer Mark Robinson called it a sad day for Lowestoft. Waveney MP Bob Blizzard said simply, "It's the end of an era." It was. No television of any kind has been mass-manufactured in Britain since. Chapter 11. The Silence in the Wrong Shape. The old Ferguson factory site on Fareham Road was cleared. The 7.6 hectares that once held the largest television factory in Europe were redeveloped for commercial and industrial use. Planning consultants were appointed by the subsequent owners, John Wyeth and Brother, a pharmaceutical company, to obtain consent for warehousing and distribution buildings. The site now forms part of the Fareham Reach Business Park area. There is no plaque, no memorial, no heritage board explaining what happened here, no preserved section of production line behind glass, no brass plate bearing the names of the women who soldered the circuits. Nothing to tell a person walking past that this unremarkable stretch of business park was once the place where every Ferguson television in Britain was born. 3,000 pairs of hands building the sets that glowed in millions of sitting rooms rented from shops on every high street, serviced by vans that covered the length of the country, carrying inside them chassis designed by British engineers and assembled by British workers in a factory that a Jewish refugee from Vienna had made the beating heart of the largest television rental empire the world had ever seen. The pattern repeated across the country. In the late 1960s, Britain had 15 to 20 television manufacturing sites, employing tens of thousands. Pye in Cambridge, AK So in Southend. Bush, Murphy in Welwyn Garden City. Decker, Dynatron in Maidenhead, all gone. GEC under Arnold Weinstock, who'd married into the Sobel television manufacturing dynasty, shifted away from consumer electronics toward defence and telecommunications, eventually becoming BAE Systems' defence arm and Marconi Communications, which itself collapsed after the dot-com bust. The television industry's death was part of something larger. UK manufacturing employment peaked in 1966 at 8.9 million, 30% of all employment. By 2019, just 2.7 million remained, 7.7%. Between 1979 and 1983 alone, over 2 million industrial jobs vanished. British motorcycles, BSA, Norton, Triumph, destroyed by Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki. British cars, Leyland Rover, broken by Japanese and German competition. Shipbuilding on the Clyde, the Tyne, the Wear, near total collapse. Port Talbot Steelworks' last blast furnace closed in 2024, down from a peak of 18,000 workers in the 1960s. The same script played out across every sector. Domestic firms failed to invest, management was complacent, industrial relations were poor, the competition proved superior, and government policy accelerated the decline rather than arresting it. No European country kept its television industry. Philips sold its TV business to a joint venture with Chinese TP-Fi technology in 2011. Grundig went through bankruptcy and is now owned by Turkish Arçelik. Thompson exited consumer electronics entirely. Samsung has been the world's #1 television manufacturer for 16 consecutive years. LG is second. Chinese brands TCL and Hisense are rising fast. The screens in your house, thinner, brighter, sharper, cheaper than anything the Gosport factory ever produced, were almost certainly made in South Korea, China or Vietnam. The technology that Ferguson pioneered, that the Thorn 2000 chassis embodied, that the women on the Gosport tracks built with their hands, it didn't disappear. It moved. It moved to countries that invested in it when Britain stopped. Walk past the business park on Fareham Road today and you'll hear nothing. No hum of conveyor belts. No hiss of solder meeting flux. No clatter of 3,000 people clocking in for the morning shift. Just the ordinary quiet of a commercial estate. Delivery vans, car parks, the low drone of air conditioning units on the roofs of buildings that could be anywhere. A factory that has been producing for decades has a particular presence. Not just the machinery, but the movement of people, the systems, the low-level sound of purpose. When that stops, what you notice isn't the absence of noise. It's the presence of a kind of silence that shouldn't be there. Jules Thorne arrived in England in 1923 with a suitcase and a talent for selling things. He built an empire that employed 80,000 people, controlled a third of every rented television in Britain, and put a screen in the corner of almost every sitting room in the country. The factory he bought in Gosport was the last place in Britain where a British company made colour televisions. It is now a business park. There is no plaque. The Ferguson name still exists, printed on LED screens assembled in County Durham, licensed from a brand management company in Houston, Texas, carrying the memory of something that 3,000 workers on the Hampshire coast once built with their hands. Whether that counts as survival is a question the silence on Fareham Road doesn't answer.